Hello everyone, welcome to the GeoEcolologist. I am Dr. Krishnanand, and in this session on physical geography, we are going to learn about the concept of earth movements. The concept of earth movements have been classified into endogenetic process and exogenetic process. So we are going to learn the details of these concepts in today's session. But before we go ahead, please like and subscribe to our channel and don't forget to share the videos with others as well. So now let's learn about the earth movements. So earth movements have been classified into these two categories first. So which is endogenetic and exogenetic. So what is this endo and exo? Endo basically means from within. So it is internal in nature, and exo is from outside. So it is external in nature. So endogenetic type of forces or endogenetic movements and exogenetic forces leading to the external kind of movements. So these are the two major categories. Then further, the endogenetic process or the forces have been divided into two segments. One is called diastrophism and the other is sudden movements. While exogenetic forces or movements have been classified into two types, that is weathering and erosion. So we are going to learn about first the endogenetic earth movements and then later on the exogenetic movements. So when we see this flow diagram, under this endogenetic we have diastrophism and sudden movements. Within further classification, we see that diastrophic movements have been further classified into these two broader categories, that are Epeirogenic or continent forming forces and orogenic or mountain building forces. So these are the two major classification of diastrophism under the endogenetic earth movements, and within which we have upward and downward movement, that is vertical movements we see, that is called Epeirogenic, which is largely continent forming, while the orogenetic, that is the mountain building, have two kinds of forces largely, which are tension forces and compression forces. So tension is moving away from each other and compression is moving towards each other. So these are the classification of the endogenetic earth movements, and further what we see is the classification of exogenic movement, that is weathering and erosion. Under weathering we have physical, chemical, biological, mechanical, several forms of weathering, and under erosion as well we have several forms, that is ice-based erosion, river water erosion, sea erosion, wind erosion and underground water erosion. So we are going to learn about each of these processes and the forms that they create under these earth movements. So let's go ahead further. So the Earth's crust and its surface, that we talk in the geomorphology as we study the physical geography part. So geomorphology, we talk about Earth's crust and its surface, which are constantly evolving. It basically means they are changing. There is an evolutionary process in that due to various forces emanating from below the Earth's surface. So remember, we have already learned about the process of plate tectonics, we have already talked about continental drift, we already know about the isostasy theories. So if you have not watched those videos, do watch those videos for the clarity in the concept. So here we talk about these forces which are emanating from below, that are called endogenic forces, as well as above the surface of the earth, which are external in nature, so they are called exogenic forces. Many times on the basis of genetic, that is origin, it is written as endogenetic or exogenetic. So endogenic or exogenic. So these forces cause physical and chemical changes both. So remember, there is a physical change, that is physical property, and chemical properties of the matter, of the Earth's matter as well. So what we see is that it changes the geomorphic structure. It leads to the evolution of geomorphic structure on the Earth's surface that we study. So some of these changes are imperceptibly slow in nature. So which are very slow. These forces are important in terms of when we see weathering, folding. So these are the processes that we are going to study in details in lectures to come. And some other are gradual in nature. So like erosion, which is very gradual in nature, while remaining are quite sudden kind of forces, which are happening suddenly out of the blue. So what happens? What kind of forces? Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, which are of sudden nature. So what we see here is that these forces have different nature. Some are very slow, some are very gradual, some are sudden. So what we see here is the earth movements, endogenetic and exogenetic for the slow movement, which is diastrophism, then we have sudden movements, and then we have exogenetic forces like weathering and erosion, which are gradual in nature. So we have all kinds of changes happening on the surface of the earth. So now first let's learn about this endogenic or endogenetic geomorphic movements. So what are these? The geomorphic processes that are driven by forces emanating from deep below the Earth's surface. So we have already studied the interior structure of the Earth, the internal part, how these layers are separated, what are their characteristics, how they vary in their density. We have also studied about the isostatic adjustment that keeps happening between these different layers. So these processes that are associated with these forces emanating from within the surface of the Earth, they are part of this endogenic forces, and that leads to the geomorphic movements. So they are called endogenic geomorphic processes. For example, folding, faulting, all these processes are associated with it. So why this happens? Let's understand the force behind these movements and their characteristics. So the ultimate source of energy behind these forces, what we see is this endogenic movement, that is Earth's internal heat. So this Earth's internal heat, the heat that is generated within the surface of the Earth, that is most important factor for these movements of endogenic nature. So Earth's internal heat is a result of many radioactive decay that keeps happening below the surface of the Earth that we know. So 50% of the Earth's internal heat is contributed by this radioactive decay. And further what we see is another factor, that is gravitation. So that causes the pressure gradients. Remember the change in pressure, that is important. So various layers of the Earth are shaped, and gravitation, that is gradient basis, it also leads to the changes. So what happens? We have two important factors here. One is the radioactive decay, second is the gravitational factor, which is leading to the pressure gradients. So differences in temperature and pressure. Now remember, we are talking about pressure and temperature gradients that we talk. So these are there within the various layers of the internal structure of the Earth, and that leads to something which is important here, which is convectional currents. So this convection, remember the gradient is like there is somewhere there is high temperature, somewhere there is low temperature. So there is a gradient. So basically it means there is a flow involved between these high and low temperatures and pressure. So this leads to this convection happening. So the Earth's rotation also leads to this Coriolis effect that we know by the name of Coriolis force. So it can influence this convectional currents traveling, and that is one important point. That is how it is distributed. This geomorphic movements of endogenic nature are distributed on the entire Earth because of this Coriolis effect. So what happens? The destination of these convectional currents determine the nature and the location. Now remember these two key words here. Nature and location of these Earth endogenetic movements are controlled by what? These Coriolis effect. And what happens? These gradients that are created are now moving on the entire surface of the Earth from within the surface of the Earth. That's why they are endogenetic in nature. So further, when we read about the classification of these movements, let's understand. These movements have been largely classified into two parts, as we know, diastrophism and sudden movement. So endogenetic movements are diastrophic in nature or sudden in nature. So diastrophism basically refers to the deformation. It means deconstruction, changes. So what happens? Deformation of Earth's crust happens because of these diastrophic movements, and remember they are gradual in nature. So they are not sudden, they are gradual. They act for thousands of years. So that is important. That's where the geological time scale, that is important. So geological time scale we need to understand for understanding this gradual movement through thousands of years. So on the other hand, sudden movements like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions happen in a very short period of time. So that is what we have classified here, the sudden movements. So what we see, diastrophic movements have been further classified or branched into epeirogenic, that is continent forming, that is subsidence and upliftment, vertical movement basically, and orogenic movements, which are mountain building, the folding and faulting part. So let's understand further the diastrophism first. So diastrophism is basically coming from this Greek word, that is dia, which is across, and strophe is basically turning. So what we see is there is an entire turning of these movements across the Earth's surface in a gradual manner. So what happens here? Just look. Diastrophism has been further classified into epeirogenic and orogenic. So vertical movement and horizontal movement. So these are two important points. So diastrophism refers to deformation of Earth's crust due to diastrophic movements, that is deforming movements such as folding, faulting, warping, bending, twisting, fracturing. All these terminologies are important here. So gradually we will be coming to the folding and faulting in a separate lecture series as well. But first we need to understand these basic concept under diastrophism. So all processes that move, elevate or build up. Remember these three words here: moving, elevation, and third is the building up of the portion of Earth's crust, how they have come into picture. So that is important that we study under this phenomena of diastrophism. So they include orogenetic and epeirogenic that we study, orogenic and epeirogenic. So oro is mountain building and epiro is continent building. So let's elaborate further. So this word epeirogeny or the epirogenetic concept was coined by G.K. Gilbert in 1890. Remember the scientist G.K. Gilbert? So he wrote about this in his USGS, United States Geological Survey work, monograph 1 on Lake Bonneville. So this was the monograph in which first time this word epeirogeny was discussed by this eminent scientist. The word comes from the scientific Greek word which is epiros. So what is this epiros basically? It means mainland. And what is genesis? We all know it basically means the origin, the birth. So origin of the continents, how these continents have been made throughout the history of the earth. So that is what we study in the epeirogeny. So this was given by G.K. Gilbert. Further, let's understand that epeirogeny or continental forming movements are radial movements in nature. So they act along the radius of the earth. That is important to remember. And their direction may be towards subsidence, that is downgoing, and upliftment, that is upgoing. So these are vertical movements that we see here. That is important from the center of the earth. So they cause upheavals or depression of land exhibiting undulations. What we see is undulation. So that is what we see is wavy surface. So wavy surface basically means up movement and down movement. That is what happens, a vertical movement. So broad central parts of the continents are called cratons. These cratons have gradually formed after the cooling of the earth's primordial matter gradually into solid surfaces. So these cratons were the building blocks of the continents and they are subject to this epeirogeny, this vertical and important subsidence movement and upliftment movement. So hence their name is continent forming movements. So what is important point to remember here? Epeirogeny is strictly vertical movement that we need to remember. Apart from that, epirogenetic movements form these things. What are these? Gentle arches, structural basins, or they lift the entire regions as well. So these are the important things that we need to remember when we are studying the diastrophic movement, under which we are studying epeirogeny, so which is continent forming. So that is important. These gentle arches, structural basins, all these are the important features that are formed on the Earth's surface. So epeirogenic uplift, let's understand this uplift, up movement first. So what we see? Raised beaches, elevated wave-cut terraces, sea caves, fossiliferous beds. So look into these diagrams here. All these things that we are talking here have been represented. So in India, if we see examples, let's understand. The raised beaches occur at several places along Kathiawar, Nellore and Tirunelveli coast. So these are very much good examples of the epeirogenic uplift. Then further we see several places which were on sea some centuries ago are now a few miles inland due to this upliftment, because of this up movement. So for example, Koringa near the mouth of Godavari, Kaveri Pattinam in the Kaveri Delta, and Korakai on the coast of Tirunelveli were all flourishing seaports about 1000 to 2000 years ago. So that is important. These are important examples of the epeirogenic uplift. Now let's talk about the other factor, that is the subsidence factor. So epeirogenic subsidence. So submerged coast or submerged platforms that we talk. For example, submerged forests and valleys as well as buildings are evidence of this subsidence. So in 1819, a part of the run of Kutch was completely submerged as a result of the earthquake. That's another example. So presence of peat and lignite beds that we study in the coal. So these are found in the Tirunelveli mines that we see, and apart from that we also see this subsidence effect in the Sundarban Delta as well. So there are numerous places, smaller islands near Sundarbans which have been now subsided in the seawater. So Andamans and Nicobars have been isolated from the Arakan coast that we see, the eastern coast, what we see here. So they have been separated by submergence. So they were part of the same formation, but now they have gone down. So on the east side of Bombay Island, trees have been found embedded in mud. So how does this tree found in this embedded mud? So this is basically talking about that they have subsided, they have gone down and about 4 meters below the lower water mark. So similar submerged forest has also been noticed in Tirunelveli coast as well in Tamil Nadu. So a large part of the Gulf of Mannar, Park Strait is very shallow in nature. So basically it is shallow in depth and has been submerged geologically in recent times. So the time scale here is geological. Recent does not mean in few years, it means in few thousand years. So that's important. A part of the former town of Mahabalipuram as well near Chennai is submerged in the sea. So when we say that few places in the coastline of India are submerged, this is one of the most important example of subsidence, especially the Epeirogenic process that we study. So on Konkan coast we see the submergence, on Andhra coast as well we find so many examples. Apart from that, Coromandel coast, we find this Payan Ghat area where you have emergence happening, the opposite of submergence. Then further, Malabar coast also we find some emergence happening. So there are some places which are up movement happening and some places where subsidence is happening. So these are some of the examples that we see when we look at this example of various places on the Earth's surface. Now, the next important is the orogeny. So what is this orogeny? We have already learned about the vertical movement in Epeirogenic. Now this is horizontal movement. So either it can be towards each other or it can be away from each other. So what is this orogeny? It is basically oro. The word is oro, which comes from the Greek word that is oros, means mountain, and genesis as we know is creation, the origin. So these are the mountain forming forces now. So remember, mountain are formed because of these movements. So this term was introduced by G.K. Gilbert in 1890 to describe the process of mountain building as well. So orogeny and epeirogeny are two brothers. One is vertical and one is horizontal movement. We need to understand oro is mountain, so mountain forming, and epeiro is mainland, that is continent forming. So how these continents have formed and how these mountains have formed is hidden in the concept of this epirogenetic and orogenetic movement, which are part of the diastrophic forces, the slow forces, the gradual forces. So type of orogenetic forces are tensional force, compressional force, and shear. So let's understand this with a diagram. So what is this compression? Just look here in this particular image. We see that this person and this person is pushing this block in the same direction towards each other. So this is compressing. Then further, if they are taking the object away from each other, then there is a creation of tension. And then another important force is shear. What is shear? The direction is opposite of each other. What we say is, right, this movement is this way and this movement is this way, but obviously the same portion is not there in the picture. So different portion of the same land. So one movement is in the opposite direction of the other. So this is called shear. So these types of stress that develop because of this horizontal movement of the earth crust. And remember, we have already studied about the concept of continental drift and plate tectonics. So before stress, what happens? There is a plane surface, what we see. Then shear happens. So you see this movement of the same block in different directions. So there is a movement along this particular fault line. So rock is pushed opposite directions associated with transformed plate boundaries that we have already studied. So remember, which force acts? The diastrophic force of orogeny acts, which is called shear, where we have transformed fault margins. Then in the tensional portion, what we see is movement away from each other. So this is divergent boundary that we have studied in plate tectonics that happens. So there is a fault creation here. Then compressional forces, these lead to the mountain formation because this material is pushed upwards because of this horizontal movement from both the sides. These are the important features that we study under this concept of the orogenetic forces. So in contrast to epirogenetic movement, when we study this orogenic movement, remember they are more complicated deformation. They are not that simple on the Earth's crust. They are associated with crustal thickening. The thickening of this Earth's crust is important here. So this convergence of these tectonic plates, sometimes as we study in the Western Alps and the Himalayan formation, because these plates move towards each other and the material in the between rose up. So this is how these mountains were formed, the Himalaya and the Alps. So such plate convergence forms orogenic belts. So these belts that we see here in the diagram, these are the orogenic belts, and they are the resultant of these particular forces that we are studying, leading to this folding and faulting of the layers of various rocks that are there. So by intrusion of magma and volcanism as well, they sometimes lead to this orogenetic movement and creation of different landforms. So orogenic or the mountain forming movements that we see are not, again remember, that was radial in nature, the Epeirogenic. This is tangential in nature. So that's important. On the Earth's surface, its nature is tangential. So this is a circle and this is tangent. So the movement is tangential. The other movement was radial. So that is the difference between tangential and radial movements. So epirogenetic is radial movement, and remember the orogenetic is tangential movement. So forces are horizontal, but the impact is on tangent. So tensional forces produce fissures. So as you see here in this diagram, so these kind of fissures are formed due to this tensional forces, while compression leads to these folds that we see. So earlier this rock strata must have been like this. So what happened when they were pushed from each other sides? So then what happened? They folded. All these rock layers folded, and this is what we talk in the orogenetic movements. Now going to the next segment. After diastrophism, in the endogenetic process, what we study as the sudden movement. So already we have made a video that you have studied, or if you have not watched, do watch in the playlist. It's there on the earthquakes. So these earthquakes are part of these sudden movement under endogenetic process. Why? Because these earthquakes originate at the focus or hypocenter, remember, within the surface of the earth, and then they come to the surface of the earth. All these primary and secondary and other waves originate. So this is from within the earth. Same happens in the case of volcanoes. The lava from within comes to the surface of the earth through this vent. So this is what happens in the volcanism. So sudden geomorphic movements occur mostly at lithospheric plate margins. Remember here the plate tectonic concept comes into the play again, that plate margins are those places where these movements are pronounced. So we have already studied the concept, and in detail we are also going to learn about volcanism in the lectures to come. So remember, they are part of the endogenetic process. So diastrophic or sudden movement forces that we study. So these forces do what? They lead to the changes, various kinds of landforms, mountains, continents, continental margins, and several places that we study on the Earth's surface in geomorphology part of the physical geography. We find these changes happening. So these are the forces that are responsible for these changes. So we are going to study about furthermore the exogenetic process like weathering and erosion in the lectures to come. So now that we have learned about the basic concept of these endogenetic and exogenetic process, their several types and their classification, in the lectures to come, we are going to learn about the details of furthermore concepts like geosynclines, folds, faults, volcanism, and several others. So stay tuned, stay safe, and all my best wishes.